Hi. Sorry, hiccup there. I'll figure out some way to talk about it without maybe needing the sound, but it might be tough because we aren't talking about music. Um, so just a little bit about myself. I've been in front of the computer since I can remember. I do a lot of different things, but one of the things that I do is technical art. A lot of it is to do with experience or space. In this instance, I'm talking about my experience working with the remastering of Bjork's Nakura, which is an incredible album. I also am a music lover and a DJ. If you're curious, I'm playing at Nightclub 101 on December 2nd. So today I'll be talking about kind of a more theoretical and conceptual standpoint on how we got to where we got to with virtual reality, what virtual reality means. So sort of a historical and social lens. And then I'll be talking about how we got into the modern era of VR, what making VR experiences now looks like. Then I'll be getting into like Bjork's lore a little bit, as well as this album and the process of remastering it. So virtuality in itself can be unpacked quite a bit from an ontological and philosophical sense. If you look at the word starting from around 1400 onwards, going off of its Latin origins, it kind of means the essence of something, right? But it's not necessarily a physical or tactical thing. It's a virtue. It's typically something like courage or manliness in most cases. And then from the 1830s onwards, we see a lot of developments in optics, and then we kind of see it starting to be used to describe an image or reflection of something. We don't really get to the modern use of virtuality until about 1959, which is when the computer sense starts dominating the word virtual reality. This means something that is created by software, but also doesn't necessarily physically exist. But like I said, there's a lot of discourse around this word. Even Deleuze has its own sort of theory on virtuality, and what this means for truth and truth making. So just kind of an entry point into what virtuality means. This is an illustration of back in 1838 when we had the stereoscope invented, which is, like I mentioned, optics development, which basically you have two slightly different images for your left and right eye, and then your brain puts them together, and then you see something that feels like 3D. So this is kind of the fundamental or foundational element of a lot of our modern VR technologies, which is the stereoscopic vision. A lot of you probably are familiar with that. Um, in 1935, we have a short story called Pygmalion Spectacles, published in a science fiction pulp magazine. I find this story really fascinating. It didn't actually gain a lot of traction when it came out as being particularly prophetic or anything like that. But I think down the line, back in the more like the 60s and 70s, people started attributing this more to like this might be one of the first instances in which virtual reality as we know it is depicted. So for as a refresher, Pygmalion is basically the myth where a Pygmalion sculptor falls in love with his sculpture Galatea, and she's a creation of his own practice, of his own making. So this story is basically a man who falls in love with a woman who's a construction in this simulation of sensory immersion. And just to contextualize sort of the language and stuff around it, I included a little bit of the some language. So just to read the very first sentences, he says, "But what is reality?" asked the gnome-like man. He gestured at the tall banks of buildings that loomed around Central Park, with their countless windows glowing like the cave fires of the city of Cro-Magnon people. All is dream, all illusion. I'm your vision as you are mine. So we sort of get this basis of not only a modern setting of New York City, but also cave people with Cro-Magnon people. And we have this idea of what is that you see around you? What is this input that you're taking in, and what is the reality that you make? I don't need to necessarily go into reading the rest of the text, but what I find fascinating is the depiction of entering the experience, having this lush world sort of encapsulate you, and sort of this dropping into a world, because I think a lot of us can relate to this when we first put on like the Apple Vision Pro for the first time, or like tried VR for the first time, and your senses are completely overtaken by the visual stimulation around you and the sounds, especially this sort of spatial representation. And for more context, like this guy, the protagonist in the story, he's like drinking, he's drunk, and this guy that he witnesses, who gives him this headset and this mysterious liquid. He's offering this sort of antidote to his modern condition because he's just like a banker. He's just some guy. So then he falls in love with this woman. It's like a very romantic love story. And then he comes out of the experience. And coming out of this experience, he has almost like a come down, right? He's like, everything around me is so dull. It's so gray. What am I doing here? And then the last sentence, he was in love with a girl who had never lived in a fantastic utopia that was literally nowhere. He threw himself on his bed with a groan that was half a sob. So it's depressing coming out of this because you've created such a beautiful reality in your head. And now you're back to the physical reality around you. So why does this matter? Why does the 1930s matter? Well, I think it's fascinating because there's some parallels to what we have today. We have the social context, which is we have the Great Depression, we have economic despair and world wars going on. We have the technological developments. We have new media, radio, cinema, aviation, all these things people are excited about. We have people who are like really interested in pulp fictions, this sort of dissemination of media that we haven't really quite seen before. And it kind of leads to the spirit of escapism, leading to the golden age of science fiction. People like Isaac Asimov in 40s or Aldous Huxley in 30s. And this, I think, is interesting because, so first of all, Pygmalion spectacles, it sort of introduces these ideas of the senses and constructing your reality based off of your sensory feedback. We have this idea that you're interacting with something in your reality through this idea of simulation. And then we have the more softer ideas of what is an emotional truth. We have this language of idealism and romance. And this is kind of contradictory to a lot of the other sci-fi that was happening at this time, which was much more hard science oriented. And if you read this short story, which I think it's a really interesting read and you should, it feels much more like a transcendentalist piece of literature. But we have this underlying technological tension, which is you experience transcendence, and then you also experience this loneliness that results from it. You might experience this empowerment, like you're in control, and then you also feel alienated by your experience. And this kind of goes along through even what we feel now today with how we interact with technology around us. And just briefly to follow like a line, if Pygmalion spectacles introduce the idea of the headset, we have this idea of space and interaction with space that comes around more in the 60s and 70s. Myron Kruger is mostly attributed to this. He creates this installation called Video Place, which basically uses a combination of cameras, sensors, video displays, and these basically interactive technologies in which the space situates you rather than you wearing a headset.
Since '84,
so just kind of showing a little bit about what they were making at the time.
The advances that we've had in the way of
sort of like just these experiments in making stuff that's more playful, making stuff that feels.
And so this is it's always been a little going on in the environment, but what in a static sense, but what was going on, say, in a person responding to a person as terrain, instant by instant.
So just from that brief snippet, you can kind of see we have this idea of experiential interaction where you can have multiple people interacting in the same space. There's more of a performance, participation, there's play involved, and it really grounds this idea of presence and the space that you're in, which kind of augments the previous experience, which is isolated and it's only for you. I don't need to go into all this stuff, but basically there's like a lot of VR advancements in the 80s and 90s, mostly around NASA and like early game companies, and also this aesthetic of really futuristic like tech experiences. Culturally, this also parallels what's happening with the technological advancements. So 1981, we have simulacra and simulation come out, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We have William Gibson with Neuromancer and cyberpunk aesthetics. We have computers as theater, which contextualizes computers and technology as a stage. So technology is not just a tool, but it's a medium through which you can express your ideas. We have Snow Crash, which introduces the idea of the metaverse, or really fleshes it out with the avatars and digital presence. And then in the 90s in general, we have a lot of performance artists taking to the stage, what it means to be present, what reality is, what the self is. And so a lot of these things are all connected. And, this is just kind of an overview of like one aspect in a very particular way. So there's a lot more, of course, but this is just kind of like a couple smatterings or examples of how we are thinking about the construction of reality, both in an artistic, social, and technical way. I thought this was kind of a funny little like way to illustrate simulacra and simulation if you guys potentially have forgotten. But basically, we start off with a pumpkin, which is the reality. We have a pumpkin pie, which is kind of one layer of manipulating it. Then we have the pumpkin spice latte, which evokes the idea of a pumpkin pie, but doesn't actually have any pumpkin in it. And then we have this pumpkin pie spice coffee creamer, which doesn't even have any of the original elements, but is meant to evoke this pumpkin fall autumnal spirit. So this is kind of something where we apply this a lot when we think about what creating an experience is for people, right? Like when we want people to feel something, when you go into Disneyland, which is another thing that Baudrillard often talks about, is the ways in which people manipulate the signs and the signals around them to give you the idea of something. This is one excerpt from Computers as Theater, where Laurel says, movies did not flourish until engineers lost control to artists, or more precisely, to the communications craftsmen. The same thing is happening now with personal computers. Think of the computer not as a tool, but as a medium. So it's really key here to think about how people and artists are using computers to create these artistic elements and these emotional things to sort of inspire people beyond just like, okay, I use computers for work, that sort of thing. VR kind of dies down in the 90s because the internet, and it kind of goes out of fashion. At least this is from what I've reading. I was born in the 90s, so I don't know like firsthand, but this is what I've been reading about. So we kind of get a loss of enthusiasm in VR for a while. Modern VR comes. We have the Oculus Rift Kickstarter. We have Google Cardboard trying to bring VR to the people. 2020, we have COVID-19 pandemic, where we get more resurgence of interest in VR experiences for people at home who maybe want to go to concerts at home, who want to get a boxing workout at home. There's more of this, there's a re-energization of what VR could be. And then, honestly, I would argue that that was not really long lasted. I would say right now, VR is not really a hot topic for people. It's definitely fallen out of discourse unless you're an enthusiast, unless you really, really care about this. So right now we have the Meta Quest 3 and the Apple Vision Pro as the kind of key players in the market, although we do have, I think, other competitors too that just haven't gotten the traction. But as we all know, there's a level of cringe, I guess, that Mark Zuckerberg has sort of brought to the VR world, especially with Horizon Worlds and stuff like that. Like he's become the subject of kind of a lot of mockery. And I think it's because people are becoming more aware to a lot of these factors, right? We're aware of capitalism and how it affects our daily lives. We're aware of how commerce works, these big tech companies, people are skeptical. We have social media becoming this thing where people are like, oh, I don't really want to have it, but like I need to. We have surveillance becoming more of a theme that people are pushing back against. Like, I don't want people knowing what I'm doing. I don't want these companies to like know what I'm doing. So there's a level of distrust that's happening with these companies in general, which is making it difficult for people to understand VR as like an artistic medium. And I mean, I think it's debatable if people as like a general like majority even think about VR day to day. Like I think again, it's not one of those things that is a common topic of interest for people. So this is like a very simplistic way of thinking about how to make VR experiences. And you have on one side you have 180 or 360 video, which these are just like consumer cameras, the Insta360 cameras, where you plop them down. You can take a 360 video for yourself, you put it up on a software, and you can view it. Or you can go in the real-time 3D direction. You have Unity and Unreal as your main game engines, in which you can create these like 360 experiences that are interactable can have more depth to them. I guess I wanted to fast forward and talk about probably what most people want to hear about, which is Volnakura and Bjork and making the remaster of Volnakura. But I wanted to bring all that context to sort of situate Bjork as well as a really unique artist and practitioner who also believes in the art form of technology and the emotion behind technology. Because just, I guess, just kind of like by a show of hands, is there anyone who isn't familiar with Bjork or who might need more of like a primer on who she is? Okay. Okay. So Bjork, she has been an artist since around the 90s. She's been one of the most prolific, I would say, avant-garde artists in pop music. And she has a lot of work that interrogates these ideas of science, technology, as well as art, like as a from a fashion lens, from a sculptural lens, from a lot of elements. She's very quotable. She's pretty quirky. She's Icelandic. Um, so I guess here's a little clip of her talking about this computer to kind of just like again ground who she is.
In fact, you're watching very, very many frames when you're watching TV. Your head is very busy all the time to calculate and put it all together into one picture. And then, because you're so busy doing that, you don't watch very carefully what the program that you're watching is really about. So you become hypnotized. So all that's on TV, it just goes directly into your brain, and you stop judging if it's right or not. So you just swallow and swallow. This is what an Icelandic poet told me once. And I became so scared to television that I always got headaches when I watched it.
Yeah, she's very unique in the way that she thinks. So a lot of her lyrics and her lyricism is really kind of one of a kind, and I think that they read like poetry. So I would recommend, you know, listening or exploring some of these elements because she's definitely influenced a lot of other artists. She worked with a lot of really cool, you know, music video directors. She worked a lot with Michael Gondry, who directed this video. And I don't know if I should, I'm gonna skip it because in the interest of time, but a lot of really amazing music videos that I think stand up to possibly being some of the most interesting music videos in like this era in the 2000s. Um, so we kind of wanted to situate also a little bit of her interest in biology and technology. She works a lot with these engineers to create procedural experiments or apps to explore how sound translates to other senses. She is inspired a lot by synesthesia and sort of the crossing of our senses. Um, and yeah, here's a little bit of Biophilia, which is her 2012 album. And what you're seeing here is an app that you could actually play with to explore kind of the mappings of ideas in this album.
And they say back then our universe was a cold black egg.
And that's who made sort of the score representation of the notes. His name is Malinowski, and we worked with him also on Volnakura because we had a similar translation from musical notes into what we can conceive of them to be beyond sound. So whether that's visual or tactile, even in the VR experience. So I'll get into that in a little bit, but Volnakura. Oh, Volnakura. Volnakura is considered one of her most divisive albums because unlike her previous work, it's really sad. It's really sad. She broke up with her longtime partner who she had a kid with, and this album basically depicts her heartbreak. Um, this is kind of the front cover and the deluxe cover of the album. And you know, I feel really grateful to have worked with her because she kind of explained a little bit more about the choice of color and imagery in this album cover. obviously it's a beautiful piece of work as it is, but in this case, she was inspired by the idea of the wounded healer, which is a tarot card idea. So the wounded healer is basically someone who can channel their pain and suffering and basically use that to expand their empathy with which they help other people. On the right side, we have her upside down, covered in wax, with a wound that's actually in both images. And the wound is looks like the female anatomy as well as is in the place of the heart. And this basically speaks to a lot of her ideas about womanhood as well as love and pain and heartbreak and the way in which to repair from that. So the purple wax is kind of like a healing balm, and the yellow color represents also this idea of like sort of a salve to heal with. And then the black kind of, I'm not really sure if I'm gonna say this in the right way, but she told us that the black latex look was inspired by BDSM. So I don't know how that fits in exactly with everything, but that's kind of where it originated from. And then her headpiece, the headpiece that she's wearing is also related to the tarot card imagery. And it kind of also gives off the vibe of like a porcupine shell, where you don't want to necessarily get too close, but it does look really nice. So to break down a little bit of the situation that Wolnapura is, we have the physical space and site that she uses, which is Iceland and its unique landscape, its mountains, including the lava fields. And we have this really particular atmosphere, which is meant to be, you know, daytime, but really suffocating, really dry, but also wet at the same time by it being, you know, surrounded by glaciers and bodies of water. We have the personal context of it, which is heartbreak and loss. We have these themes of family and personal connection, and then these themes of pain, perishing, and rebirth, and what this means as a human, really. And then from an aesthetic standpoint, we have the musicians and artists, Arca and Jesse Conda, who contributed a lot to this body of work. And like I mentioned to tarot, like tarot imagery before, as well as she's also influenced kind of by this like punk and counterculture aesthetic. One of the key contributors to this project was Andrew Thomas Wong, who came up with this avatar idea. And he basically had an amazing team of artists come up with this sort of visual like language. This is the avatar that's used in the song Family, which I will get into a little bit. So here's another exploration of the avatar. And here's some other breakdowns of the aesthetic elements of this avatar. So this is kind of one of our first challenges in making VR, because we have this beautiful, gorgeous avatar that they've made in a software, I think probably Maya or Blender or something like that. And when you throw things into a game engine, it doesn't perform like you want them to in an offline render or an offline software. So right off the bat, we encounter this issue of having one version, which is the most artistic, the most ideal, the most high quality version. And then we have the decimated version, the performant version that we're using for mobile devices. And for all intents and purposes, when you're developing a VR experience, you're basically developing a mobile experience, because those headsets kind of function like, the performance of them are not nowhere close to your desktop computer or anything like that. So here's another example of the difference that we encounter between the original concept and what we see in Engine. So we're actually using Unity for the VR experience. A big reason was just because when this was originally made in I think that the original VR experience took like 2 years to develop from 2015. So it started in 2015, didn't come out until 2017. But the headset at the time was the HTC Vive. And the HTC Vive, I don't even know if I used it, but it's one of those earlier headsets, and you had to release on Steam. And I think Unity was the main software at the time. I don't think Unreal was even in the picture for VR experiences. Even now, when we were looking at VR for Apple Vision Pro, Unity didn't even support Unreal didn't support Apple Vision Pro development, but I think that they recently announced it. Anyway, so on the left, we see the concept for Bjork in her native land of Iceland. And then on the right, we see the Unity depiction of it. So it's actually a composite as well. It's not purely straight out of Engine. But you can tell there's a huge difference with the way that the wax looks, with the way that the figure looks. And this motif of the fossil is really, really important to her because, I mean, you know, fossil, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of death and life and permanence. And so this idea of like fossilization of something, having it could be preserved in a way that you will look back on it later on and see what that looks like. So for her, since Vulniker was such a personal album, the fossil is sort of this like uh, marker for her. This was like her medium to which to express her pain. So one of the first launches that you probably saw if you paid attention to her work at the time was her video for Stone Milker. And the way that this was made, this was also directed by Andrew Thomas Fong, is a pretty sketchy setup. Like they basically were using 360 cameras and Andrew was like hiding behind a rock as he was shooting it. And then they would stitch it later. But if you check it out, the visual quality it's pretty poor. Like I'll just show a little snippet. Beautiful song. Let me see if it'll let me. Oh yeah, I can do the rotation.
A juxtaposition in fate.
So I remember when this came out and Google Cardboard was a thing, and I remember people being like, "This isn't like really VR. Like this is just like a 360 experience, and like, what is this basically?" Um, and similarly, when there's a lot that's funny about the launch of these VR experiments because actually they were so hackily put together, right? We have two songs on this album, Not Get and Family, which are pure VR experiences in the sense that they were made in real time engines and had interactive elements. So here's like a little snippet of Not Get, but I'm pretty sure that this was recorded in engine from the computer and not from headset.
Once you fell out of love, oh, our love couldn't carry you.
Time, this was really, really cool because actually with the team who worked behind this, which was Nick Thornton-Jones and Warren Dupree, they used pretty complex mocap and volume capture to get the information used in this. But as you can see, the quality is pretty poor, and it's a gorgeous video. And this is one of the ones that I worked on remastering. Similarly with Family, like, let me see if I can fast forward a little bit. This one was directed by Andrew Thomas Fong. And here we have the motif, the recurring motif of the wound in the heart and sewing it back together. So the interaction in this scene actually is using your controllers. You can sew it. There's a little bit of haptic feedback to basically sew the threads. So these last two videos were basically from the original like shipment, but people hated it. Like people really did not like the experience of these apps, which is a bummer because they're visually gorgeous. And even when they were going on tour with it initially back in, I think, yeah, 2019, people complained that they just weren't working. You'd show up to the event and it just wasn't working. But yeah, if you go on Steam, it's got like a pretty bad rating. And a lot of complaints are interaction, audio, and people acknowledge like, hey, it's difficult to acknowledge the artistry with these distractions. So no matter how good, how amazing of an artist you are, you do need to focus on getting the technical aspects at least usable for people to appreciate it. There's so many challenges in remastering this. A lot of it came down to resources. 3D stuff is not cheap, and usually musical artists don't have budget to really afford like crazy work, unless you're, I don't know, a major pop star. But if you are someone who is avant-garde, it is generally hard to secure resources to make these experiences. And then we have like a whole host of other issues that are all interconnected, ranging from the platform to visual, to preserving the visual integrity, as well as preserving the narrative integrity, as well as trying to make the audio sound good on these new platforms. Spatial audio was a huge challenge in this. We had to chase down the original stems, which if you're working with an artist like Bjork, it's very hard to chase down the original stems. But we managed to do that. And then also with Unity, we had to update from the built-in pipeline that they were using back in 2015 to universal rendering pipeline. One of my biggest gripes with this whole project was when I showed Natka, and you see that ball of like hair, which kind of looks like, I had to rewrite that for the new Unity rendering pipeline with VFX Graph and try and port over the physics simulation from the original physics simulation, which I'm happy to not have to do it again in my life. And one of the things that we introduced in the remastering was this sense of a homepage, which was the Iceland environment. There wasn't really a homepage before. You kind of just dropped in, and it kind of was like really low poly, and you're kind of like, hello. And so we really worked hard on maintaining this, on making this Icelandic navigatable zone. And this was really hard to capture Iceland properly. This is one of the biggest challenges in this project, was how do we make it feel like Iceland without myself having ever gone? Luckily for the launch of this, I was able to go and help launch this project, and then everything made sense. I was like, Iceland makes sense now. I get why we made it like this, because she was so insistent on making it feel drab and depressing. She was like, no, it needs to feel depressing and suffocating. I'm like, okay. And you know, my supervisor was like, are you sure you don't want to throw an aurora in there? And she was like, are you serious? And yeah, there's just like some little fun things that we added, which was basically like little interaction elements. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. Another technical endeavor that we did was converting all the scores into 3D. So going from Malinowski's original just 2D chart of scores. So having to write, for example, the spiral in Unity. So Malinowski, all of his scores were in C++. So we had to convert everything into shader. Writing this in shader was like an interesting thought experiment. I think it took us like a while to wrap our heads around what was happening. And then once we did, we were like, okay, that makes sense. But yeah, converting everything from that primitive form into stuff that the shaders could read was another crazy endeavor. Then, you know, we have new Unity. We have to rewrite the shaders. Things aren't going to look quite the same, but we're trying to keep the energy of it. So the shaders in this are using a completely different sort of process, I guess you would say. There are many specifics with why we couldn't directly port the shaders over. Like, for example, just the way that the lighting works and the way that the pipeline works. We have like even things like emission properties and the glowingness and the bloom changes from version to version, from pipeline to pipeline. So the wax, for example, looks different from what it did in the past. But really my focus was keeping the integrity of the narrative element while also evoking like similar feelings. This is at the end of Family, when she's like kind of reached more of a conclusive point, and she's you kind of walk through this avatar at one point, it's like consuming you. Again, sorry, I'm rushing, we're kind of reaching the end. And then in Not Get, here's the simulation I was talking about before, which is what we call the death wig, which is essentially something that consumes you. Luckily, we didn't have to record any new mocap or anything like that. If we did, that would have been a whole other story. I think I forgot to include one of the clips, but basically one of the challenges here was we you have this physical simulation, right? And we're working with MetaQuest and AVP, and AVP is so much of a more stronger device than MetaQuest. So a lot of these creative decisions that we basically had to decide whether or not we wanted to keep it or not, because we wanted to keep the experiences the same across two platforms, or we were down with having MetaQuest have fewer things. Like, were we okay with the MetaQuest potentially not having this wig? And my decision was like, no, like this piece is kind of basically about the wig and how it progresses through the story. Um, so in the end, we basically came up with a way to bake the simulation, but in a really, really clever way where we basically baked all the vertices into a position map. And then we used the position map as an input for the physics simulation, or to replace the physics simulation. So it wasn't simulating in real time, which is actually what most of the performance drop was coming from. Because Unity, which is super efficient now with the burst compiler, so if you use physics simulations like on PC, it's super fast. Once you're on the MetaQuest, it gets throttled like crazy. So we essentially replaced the physics simulation with a baked simulation and just fed it through the rendering pipeline, and it ended up working from MetaQuest. But all these recordings are from AVP simply just because the resolution is higher. And even things that we try to keep the same ended up looking different. So bloom looks different from device to device. Color looks different from device to device. That was one of the biggest struggles is AVP color looks amazing. And then you look at the same thing on Quest and you're like, I don't remember making it look like this. So yeah, I think that there is a lot of learnings that we had in this process. And the main struggle, again, was lack of resources. If we had another technical artist who could tag team, I think even having another person to bounce ideas off of would have been great. But unfortunately, we only had what we had and we made do with what we could. And if you're interested, these are now on MetaQuest and AVP platforms. You can view them on your own device if you have one, and if not, you can look it up on the internet. So thank you, and I guess I'll take questions.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm really interested in well, no, just interested in the whole thing. It's a very cool talk. But in the beginning, when you were focusing the history of like the idea of virtual reality and like how it got to where we were, and talking a bit about I guess some of like the like emotional or like moral like pitfalls that come out of like a virtual environment. Talking about the tension between empowerment and abandonment and loneliness. I think that's really interesting and important to think about. I was wondering if you speak just a bit about like how does having that like in the back of your mind affect like your work and the way you work.
Yeah, I'm always thinking about emotion and the personal. I think that it's easy to try and detach yourself when you're working on a technical project, because you're so inundated with just like trying to make it work. But then at the end of the day, like when it comes to prioritizing how you go about making something, if your goal is to try and make your audience feel something, then maybe there's some ways in which you work around like a technical problem. Like maybe like for example in this situation, like if we really technically were struggling with the wig. If there's another way to emotionally encapsulate this motif or this signal, maybe I would have gone with it. But at the end of the day, like I feel really driven by the theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of what I'm making, right? Like I don't want to just make something that doesn't have the human aspect in mind, if that makes
Yeah.
yeah.
Are you sorry, Stella, are you thinking and also like, or does this come into play or maybe not, like thinking about what it will be like, that transition back to the real world for the user, like what it will mean when when the experience is over, like, and worried about like them feeling abandoned or disempowered after the virtual experience.
It's a great question. I think I haven't really consciously thought about it, but in thinking about this experience, it's such a depressing album. Honestly, that afterwards you kind of like you feel like you honestly take on a lot of the pain, and so that can be cathartic too. people like experiencing pain. That's why we watch sad movies, so it's a catharsis, but you can't really feel responsible for how the audience takes it. That's kind of the beautiful part, is the ambiguity, right? We don't know what people are going to walk away with, but you can try your best to try and create an experience. Yeah.
I have like a 1.5 question thing, but the first one is just you had a card that had two tensions on it. One was transcendence versus loneliness, and the other one was empowerment something. Like I didn't, it wasn't fast enough to write it.
Let me find it.
Yeah, because he said was it
Alienation.
Alienation.
Yeah.
There. And then the other one is speaks to asset conversion and resource that you needed. So just like thinking like a producer, how long did this take? Blah, blah, blah. What do you think the biggest challenge was in asset conversion? Because you mentioned C++ and then going to Unity shaders. So like, I'm curious to understand if there were any, even like, quote, 3D that are actually 2D card, kind of like, were there sheets that were there that you had to just say, I'm not going to try to, I'm just going to build it? Like, did you have to do like real, like the way it sounds like you have to do the whole thing?
Yeah. So a lot of the assets that we were able to keep were textures, but we did a lot of work on the meshes, like a lot of decimation or a lot of combining. The people who had the developers who had worked on the project before, we didn't have access to, and they basically made everything really not performant. Like you could, like when you inherit a project and you see it and you're like, what is this mess? The code was unorganized, the assets were not optimized, like everything was like what is happening here? So we had to do a lot of work on the meshes. We created a lot of new assets with the environment. The shaders were basically all rewritten unless they were standard shaders. There was a part when I realized that they were actually shader forge shaders, managed to get shader forge on one of my old computers, try and like look at the node graphs and see what was happening, but the logic doesn't necessarily apply in the new pipeline. So then
you did Unity to Unity.
Yes. Yeah, but it was Unity 2015 to Unity. We were using 6.
Yeah.
So there were three versions in between. So it wasn't just like a upgrade this. It was like a try and upgrade this 3 times and see what happens.
It's just amazing how it's also expensive.
Oh, did you get it?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
It's like $10. I think it's like $49.99.
Yeah.
But it's like it's an art piece.
Yeah.
And it's like having art in your phone. It's great.
Yeah, that was kind of the whole one of the aspects of pricing, right? It's like how much do people actually want to pay for a VR experience in which
You got me.
like we would consider you a fan or someone who's committed to investing in these experiences. But for the everyday person, it's hard to imagine you spend $50 on a video game, which you can play like 100 hours of, right? But from an album, I guess I mean, these songs are long, like Black Lake is 10 minutes long and Not Get is like 7 minutes long. So these are long songs, to be fair. But you're not necessarily going to rewatch them over and over again, like a game.
She's toured exhibition style like this before, so I think that's
Yeah.
what's great about this is I would go if there was a show like the monologue or whatever, there was 50 of these. You can get a bunch of people in every 15 minutes.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, that one of the complaints when she was doing the tour at like MoMA and etc. was half of the time it was broken. Like it was like you would show up and go, sorry, it's broken. So there's a fidelity there that wasn't really hit. And so this time around, wanting to make it a consumer product where when you do a demo, you can control the situation, right? Like you can see like what is happening and can be like, let me fix this. When you release it into the world, that's when the user becomes the person who's in control of the situation. So you relinquish some power a little bit. That's why you have to make it really, really buttoned up. And also to get past the app approval process with Apple and with Meta took us a while in itself. So having to get to that point also is challenging.
I think we can squeeze in one more question. Cassidy. Hi, this is really interesting. I have so many questions even about the business side of this, so I can just gonna do it for another hour, so thanks for this. But I wanted to ask kind of about the role of the artist and the director of the actual experience in this. Can you talk a lot about working with the director of Ice Cream the Original, practice and music video and stuff like that? And I was thinking about another experience I saw this week, not to plug it, my friend's show, Masquerade, the Phantom of the Opera immersive experience. It was really similar in that you're asking audience members to engage and to play in these predefined, constructed worlds that also have a really specific narrative and cueing structure that you're trying to hope that audiences will engage with and guide through the experience, I guess, correctly. So in the context of all of the technical work that you and your team had to do, what was that relationship like with the artist and the director, where you're trying to create these moments for audience members to sit and really feel, as well as trying to encapsulate the feelings of the original pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it was pretty tough balancing what we wanted to do and what we wanted to preserve from the original one. We did have a process in which we would get approval from Bjork and her team. And if Bjork didn't have the bandwidth, we would get approval from her creative like art director, who James Mary, who's also great. He did a lot of the wardrobe and costume design for her. And it was pretty tough because I was definitely very much, we have to preserve the sadness, we have to preserve the artistic integrity. And then some other members of my team were like, let's make it let's make it colorful, let's make it poppy. I was like, I don't know about that. So at the end of the day, any decision that we made went through her team, but that was difficult to chase her down because sometimes she'd be recording in wherever she's recording. Sometimes she'd be traveling. So that, and also with the timing of Cornucopia, which came out in our interview on BBC, it was really hard to just figure out how to time it, how to access her when it was a good time. But we were fortunate enough to have probably quite a few sessions where we spoke face to face and just really ironed out a lot of the details. But it was pretty difficult, really. And like we didn't have access to the original directors as much. Like we had a couple meetings, but everyone was basically donating their time because it was a pretty bootstrap project. Yeah.